The number one thing that you've learned through your experience?
That's a really good question. I have learned that on the ground, everywhere on Earth, there are people fighting like nobody's business for justice and peace. And you may perhaps never know their names. And in many cases, you don't get to know their names because they are gone or effectively disempowered or imprisoned. The challenges of being a woman peace builder are enormous, and it's even a deadly profession. But there is nowhere on earth that you can go where you won't find these people working. You just have to have the eyes to see them.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you make that point that women aren't really written out of history. They're rather never written in. Tell me about that. Like, why? Tell us about motivations. That can be very frustrating, I think, especially to those of us here in the United States. Help me understand why you think that is.
Well, I know that is because I've seen the evidence of what women do, and in some cases I've seen that they've done these things right in front of the CNN cameras and still not been written in. So this is just a fact. I think there's a complex cocktail of influences that create this. For instance, the women don't look serious enough, right? They don't look like real serious people. Now, that's because they're women, right? And like the first indicator of seriousness that many of us are trained to recognize right out of the gate is that we see color, we see clothing, we see gender, we hear accents, we recognize the sound of a person who went to the same university or one of the universities. There's ways that we recognize authority pretty quickly out of the gate. And these women, in every one of these films, were dismissed, for not filling up the job description properly because they checked the wrong box on gender. So people look through them, and that is not just politicians and not just warlords. It's the journalists as well, who are only human and are raised and socialized exactly the same way we are. So one of the important goals I had in making this was to jolt the journalists awake so they start paying more attention to it.
So interesting. People look through them. The idea of actually looking through another human being. What women are being written into history and why? And then tell me about a few that we might not be familiar with that still aren't, and why.
Okay, so there's both the negative and the positive of that. And a lot of people push back on me when I talk about this and say, but women aren't necessarily peaceful. Margaret Thatcher. There's always a Margaret Thatcher person in the audience. And so I will use my grown-up public place language to say this. If you have to climb over a pile of doo-doo to get to the top, you will be covered in doo-doo when you get there. And that is the problem of systems, right? So the women who are getting written into history, generally speaking, are the women who play the game, the women who understand how it works, who understand the role of aggression, of risk-taking, of always moving forward, never questioning yourself. The women who are so busy acting more like men than men that and this is not to say that any things are biologically gendered. This is the system we've constructed, and they speak the language fluently. So those most of our examples of women that get written into history early tend to be those women, because there's something surprising about a woman in that place. And so that kind of punches her up to the front of the line, but she's going to be bringing in many cases, a more retrograde version of what we're already getting in a lot of cases. Now, the women who aren't being written in tend to be women who are the grassroots. I don't have to tell any of you guys that. And I'll tell you, just as a filmmaker, it's hard to tell their stories, right? Because these stories have multiple authors a lot of the time. These stories are, if you're resolving conflict or if you're changing political systems, a lot of the action is just talking. And a lot of the action is just sitting in meetings with low ceilings and fluorescent lights, and believe me, not very cinematic. And so it doesn't look like something important is going on. And so these are really hard stories to tell. And journalists and the people who are writing the first draft of history, because that's what journalism is, are in a highly competitive system that, first of all, doesn't recognize women necessarily as potent players or effective political actors. And second of all, the way women do it, generally speaking, is not with aggression and not with showmanship and not with risk-taking. And so it's not going to be very easy for them to sell up the line. And that's what this is about, after all, in journalism. This is why we love public interest broadcasting, by the way, because we can tell these stories in public interest broadcasting because we don't have to sell it up the line.
So when we were having dinner earlier, we had an interesting conversation about the role of women. And thinking about the role of women, we were talking in particular about Democratic Republic of Congo, where I've done quite a bit of work. And we were talking about the role of women there and how they lead and how they're effective in conflict resolution. I wonder if you might just talk about a few traits and just what you see as sort of distinguishing characteristics, because I know that I feel like a better mom and a stronger woman when I come home after I've been with those women, and I think it would just be really interesting to
The Congo's so interesting because there's what we hear, and generally what we hear about women in the Congo, in this country, is, oh my God, those poor women, it's horrible, and and it is quite awful. I mean, the trucks in Eastern Congo on any given day are carrying less than women carry on their heads. That is what life is like if you are a Congolese woman in the Eastern Congo. So they are treated like donkeys. They do the work and they get it done, and nobody thanks them for it. But the fact is, in the Congo, as in any other place, what they do is they feed, clothe, house, educate, they take care of the sick, they take care of the dying. They do everything that if you were to put it around in one tied up thing and give it a title, you would give it the title peace. Because those are the things that make communities run, those are the things that we all seek to make a good life for ourselves and for our families. So they are, in many ways, if only culturally, specialists in peace. And all of those things that they do, by the way, when they're interrupted or frustrated in communities, wind up very often being the very source of the conflict to begin with. And so they're not only in touch with all the things that have to be in place for peace to happen, but they're also in touch with the ways in which it's not happening or getting interrupted in a community. Now, we all know the story of sexual violence in Congo. We've all heard it in one way or another. It is, it's kind of awful to go there as a person with a camera, because you meet women who have been trained by Westerners and nonprofit directors and so forth to tell you the awful story. And there's almost like, okay, I'm gonna sing for my supper now. Let me tell you this awful story. There's a almost pornographic, prurient interest by those of us in the global north in that awful story. And I have never met a single one of those women who have an awful story to tell, who weren't very interested in pivoting off of that awful story, if they could hold people's attention, to tell you the next thing they did after that, which was to step up in some way and to gather the women and to find a way to organize it and whatever. And so we have a tendency to stop talking about and being interested in these women at the end of the awful story, when everything interesting about them, to me, starts that next day. And it is very important to pay attention to this, because the bad guys in the Congo did the analysis. The bad guys in Serbia did the analysis. In any country where there's been systemic sexual abuse, this is the analysis they did. We need to terrorize and break communities. If we want to drive this ethnic group out, if we want to drive this group of people, this religion, this caste, whatever it is, out, we need to break and terrorize communities. What's the best, most efficient way to do that without wasting bullets, without decreasing morale, without making men want to leave the service? We'll just go in and rape all the women. And it's what they break when they do that isn't just the women, It is the very capacity for love. Because these women have been socialized and their families have been socialized to cease love when this happens. So the bad guys have figured this out, and they very effectively exploited this fact. And what's frustrating to me is the good guys, the UN, the State Department, all the people who come in and want to build peace, never do the corollary to this, which is go into a community and say, how do we empower these women? What are they working on? What do they see as the primary problems? How do we give them what they need to succeed? How do we make them more visible? How do we make them more serious in other people's eyes? If we did the reverse, a systemic sexual assault in communities, I guarantee you we would see more effective and sustainable peace building.
So important, yes. And I so agree. Thank you for bringing that message. I know we both have spent a lot of time in that particular region, and we both know that these women in no way consider themselves victims, but they are the solution. And I'm just grateful for you highlighting that. You mentioned sort of what does the next day look like for them, and I think that's where the hope is, right? Or at least that's what allows me to fly back and to actually wake up in the mornings, to be honest, is when we think about things that make us hopeful for the future. Tell me a couple of stories or an anecdote of some time that you've been out there where you've actually seen a particular woman contribute in her best self and how that has changed an entire situation.
You know, the estimates are that 50% of the women in Liberia were raped during that conflict, 50%. And they were raped up and down the age line, from the youngest to the very oldest. And they were not broken. They were not broken. So there's a little town outside of Monrovia called Totota that's kind of a center in this one community. And the young men, as they got demobbed, they would give up their weapons, they'd get a little bit of money. They were generally very addicted to drugs because the warlords used drugs to motivate them and keep them pliable. And they generally had been living in the bush for years. They had left home at 8, 9, 10 years old because an 8-year-old can carry an AK-47. That's part of why it's such a popular gun. And they hadn't really washed and hadn't really taken care. They were not civilized. In many ways, they were like Lord of the Flies getting released, you know. And so many of them came to Totota because it was like a regional center. But they were hesitant to go the rest of the way to the next place, which was their village, where they knew they wouldn't be welcomed back. They knew that the people have you know, kind of lost patience with them. So there were guys hanging out in the middle of town under this tree, and the women were terrified, you know, because they'd spent years, you know, just seeing guys like this and being absolutely terrified of them. And days passed, and they didn't seem to be going anywhere. And then this woman, Annie, their leader, said, you know, they're just boys. I'm sorry, that the love in that, given what happened during that war and the capacity she had to remind everybody that they were just boys, is kind of extraordinary. And her capacity to lead the women of that town is incredible. So they went to the tree, they said to the boys, we want to help you. They invented a little prayer service that they did over the boys, and they led them down to the river that ran through town. And they washed them, and they cut their hair, and they washed their clothes, and they sent them out of town to their villages. They said, you're going to be all right now. To me, this is the kind of redemptive story. Was everything going to be fine? Was everybody going to live happily ever after that? No. But like, if in every village there were women who felt empowered to do this, then maybe the next village down the road would be a positive experience, and maybe the next one would be positive. That's what we have to unlock. That's what we have to empower.
So powerful. I'm going to ask one more question before we allow the audience to ask some questions. As we both know, the statistics are grim in terms of women as peace negotiators. Something like 35% of peace negotiators.
Lower by far.
Right, but is it, okay, so even lower. Okay, so lower than 35%. And the success rate when a woman is involved is substantially higher. They tend to last 15 years plus when a woman's involved. Why are more women not involved as peace negotiators? I mean, we can point out the obvious, but I mean, let's look at what success and what stats say, and help me understand, especially after us having an opportunity to watch a film like this, why things haven't changed.
We all want to think we're very grown-up people and we're motivated by information, and we're not. The UN are not motivated by information any more than you and I are, any more than a warlord is. We're all driven by these inner demons and angels that we don't necessarily examine. So we do have evidence that a peace agreement is 65% more likely to last 15 years if women are involved in its creation. So, you know, you would think you could just hand out a little thing of that information and everything would presto changeo happen, and it hasn't. In 2000, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1325. Now remember, this was the 1,325th resolution, right? It took them that long to get to the idea that women need to be involved in peace agreements. So first of all, there were 1,324 resolutions that didn't clearly help. And, you know, so they committed to this one. But the only way they could get it passed through the Security Council, much like with the women in the Northern Ireland Agreement, was if there were no teeth in it. So there were no measurables, no one was going to be held accountable. And there were 4% of women, 4% of peace negotiators were women at the time they signed the agreement. And within 10 years, it had dropped to 2%. So that is what we're up against here. And it's a bunch of different things. First of all, it's a lot of people in power who don't think it's their problem. Like, this is just a women's issue, it's just a women's thing. It's like, we're talking about serious things here. Why are you making me talk about this? So that's one of the things. In every single film we've made, you can see there's a point where they're just about to sign the agreement when all of a sudden the women disappear. When they're dividing up the money and the power, believe me, they're not giving that up without a fight. They're not giving it up unless they are forced to give that up. So there are a bunch of reasons why it hasn't changed. But one thing that I figured out about good men, because, you know, I had to go through this period where I was making all these films about awful things happening, and you do have a little moment of like, what on earth is wrong with them? And then you kind of have to come home to your husband and your sons and say, oh, it's not all of them. Because it would be very easy to go there, you know, if I didn't have any exposure to the amazing men that I love in my life. And what I started to realize was it's not all men. No, of course it's not all men. And there's a subset of men that elbows its way to the front of the military structure, elbows its way to the front of the rebel community, elbows its way to the front of the peace talks. And those are the people who are running the show. So what can we do to enable the good men that we know? Because we know men are harder on each other about being a man than they ever are on us about anything. What could we unlock if we could unlock those men who aren't the elbowers to the front and bring them in as our allies? And what I've learned about the good men, who are most of them, is for some reason, I call it the doughboy. Remember the Pillsbury Doughboy? I call it the Pillsbury Doughboy phenomenon. Like, I find that I can say something really effectively and it makes an impression, but the minute I take my finger away, it's gone. So I think that there are some lessons that are really hard to learn because they go, I mean, let's face it, when we're talking about gender, we're talking about some very deep structures in our psyche, in our heart, in everything about us, in our faith and spiritual traditions. So it is hard to absorb these things, especially if you're a man and you don't have skin in the game. So I find that it's better to try again and again and again and again. And because eventually I do find that they come with me. eventually they do start changing their reflexes. Eventually they do start looking around the room and saying, why are there's no women on this panel? They do start acting proactively. So that's what we need from them. We just need to gently do this again and again and again.